From Grief, a music meditation. I don't like to think about grief. I don't like to sing about it because my voice inevitably fails, which is what it did at my uncle's hospital bedside years ago. It's probably why I play the shakuhachi, the meditation flute. It's the voice I didn't have. Recently, there's been 4 or 5 losses. Those that happen without being able to say goodbye or remember when. It feels like a lot. And amongst us, there are so many more. I know that. During COVID, before COVID, and I think probably after COVID too. Sometimes these are sudden. No, they all feel sudden, no matter what. Sometimes they're unattended. Our people are just gone. No thank yous, no goodbyes. Sometimes no real remembrances either. This music meditation essay is a space for our thoughts. I've included none of my friends' or loved ones' names here. Instead, I've made the music so there's room for your thoughts, your memories, the names and images of your loved ones. I dedicated this to all friends and loved ones in our many circles whose memories, stories, and words we add to this meditation. Thank you for participating with me in this music meditation. Settle mind and body. Focus on breath. Breath going in and breath going out. Everything slows with shakuhachi. Breath slows in and out. From nothing, each breath, each sound arises. And back to nothingness. Each breath, each sound. My teacher, who says, play this piece over and over until the one you're thinking of is right there, standing with you. Focus on breath. Focus on sound. Into nothingness. Each breath. Each sound. And again. I want to forget. Others think about their love, but I try to forget mine. The more I try to forget, the more I remember. Remembering, I try to forget. But if I forget, then I remember. And if I remember, I can't forget. Shall I try to stop forgetting and remembering? Shall I try to throw both away? Neither will work. What can I do when my love feels every thought? It's not impossible to forget, in a case of deliberate forgetting, But that means sleeping or dying, and because of love, I can do neither. Greater than the remembering that can't be forgotten is the difficulty of trying to forget. Manhe. The dewdrop world is the dewdrop world. And yet, Issa, on the grief of losing a daughter. Haunting shakuhachi. The circles of darkness when his fingers lift. Eva Story. Warm October. Forgiveness in the air. Hillary Tan.
Good morning. My name is Susan Cadell. As you've heard, I want to start by acknowledging that I am very thrilled to live in the backyard of the current land back camp that is at Victoria Park in Kitchener. And I am thrilled to be associated with the land back camp and supporting them and learning more about the backyard that I live in, because we have so little history of our original peoples in this region. So what to say about grief and loss in 10 minutes? I decided to go with 3 very, for me, key messages that I would like to ensure that folks take away. One is that grief does not only happen after death. And second is that we all need to think about grief differently and about tattoos as ritual. So, grief does not happen after death only. It happens after loss of any kind, and right now we have so much loss in the context of COVID-19. As Chris referred to the next normal, people who are grieving often talk about a new normal, a different normal, but normal doesn't come back. Grief hurts, and it affects all of our systems. It can make changes in our sleep or our diet, or it can make us feel powerless, and we can have physical symptoms, and we can certainly have emotional symptoms. And it can go on for a very long time and affect everything, and again, doesn't just happen after death. It can happen after the loss of a job. We have loss of freedoms right now, not being able to go outside and gather with our families and hug people. There are many, many losses right now that are not just death losses, and that causes grief. Grief, I like to say, grief is always complicated, though it's not always complicated grief. Grief can happen with, it can be disenfranchised, it can be not recognized, especially around non-death losses. We tend not to think of grief, and so people don't feel legitimate in having feelings of grief. We can have anticipatory grief, so we can start grieving lots of aspects before a death. There are lots of, for instance, with dementia, there's lots of losses that happen, and there can be anticipatory grief in terms of the loss, the death loss, and losses that are non-death related, as that the person with dementia is losing abilities. There's also delayed grief. Sometimes people need to delay their grief for various reasons. It happened a lot. It was observed in the wives of firefighters after the 9/11 tragedy in New York City, and the wives of firefighters who died were taking care of their families, and they delayed their own grief. So grief can be delayed. These are all really normal. If there is such a thing as normal grief, those are all really normal aspects of grief. But it's always complicated. But it isn't necessarily complicated grief in the sense of a diagnostic category, and I think that's really important to understand. So, grief is the price that we pay for love. There's a famous movie that starts off with the phrase, "Love is all around us." I like to say that grief is all around us. Love is indeed all around us, but so is grief, and especially now, especially in COVID-19. We've never seen so much, and we don't necessarily recognize it. So I would really like us to recognize it and think about it differently. So I'm very privileged to work with an international group of scholars and practitioners in grief and bereavement, and we've been promoting the idea of grief literacy and looking at trying to get people to think about grief differently, hence my second point about we need to think about grief differently. And grief literacy, as you can see on this slide, is an individual's capacity to assess, process, and use knowledge regarding the experience of loss. We need knowledge of it, we need skills, and we need to be able to take action. And it's very interconnected with socio-cultural contexts. The image of a bus going to utopia is my group's way of envisioning a different world where we are more grief literate. So that's our bus to utopia is different ways of knowing that we live in a grief literate society. So one of the ways that I think about grief differently is with the public health model of bereavement support, which was theorized and tested in Australia and has now been tested in Ireland. And this goes back to the point about complicated grief. It looks at risk factors for complicated grief. And they theorized that only 10% of people would be at high risk of complicated grief. And in fact, when they tested it, fewer than 10% were at high risk of complicated grief. And that 30% of people are at moderate risk and only need peer support or volunteer-led support, but the high-risk people are the ones who might need professional support. And that 60% of people are at low risk, and they only need the support. They need support, but they only need the support of their families, their communities, their networks. And what's really important to think about is that 100% of those people can benefit from the support of their community, of their neighbors, of their families. And so if we strengthen that and strengthen our community's abilities to support one another, then we will be improving the experience for everyone. So this model, I think, is really, really important to contextualize the notion of complicated grief, but also to remind us that everyone can benefit from greater awareness of grief and the ability to support ourselves and one another. So I want to just mention the 5 stages of grief, which were originally conceived of about people who were dying, and they have somehow morphed into being about people who are grieving. And it's a huge disservice, and I want to say that I would really like to see that have less importance. There are aspects of it that are important for bereaved people and people who are grieving, but it's taken on a life of its own, and people think they're not grieving right if they're not following these stages in a certain order. So it is my dear wish that we lessen the importance of the 5 stages of grief. My preferred way of thinking about grief is about continuing bonds. So this image is of a family where the image was painted after the smallest child had died. So the painting was done to enshrine the place of that baby in the family. And for me, it's a really lovely illustration of how when someone dies, the relationship changes, it doesn't end. So continuing bonds is a theory that says that, and this for me is an image that illustrates that. And finally, I just have to talk about tattoos. They are a ritual, they are a way of memorializing people. They can be a way, they're not always, they can be a way of memorializing people, and they certainly can serve as a ritual to embody the relationship with the person. So the image on the slide is one example of a memorial tattoo that one of our participants had in a fairly prominent place on the front of his legs, and he talked about liking when people asked him about it so that he could talk about his friend who had died. And I just think the phrase that all saints have a past and all sinners have a future is about hope, and is certainly enshrines ritual as well. So just to finish, I want to come back to this idea that that love is all around us, and that grief is all around us, and that there is tremendous hope in that. For me, that we can learn about grief. We can learn about grief for ourselves, we can learn about grief for others, and that we can better support one another. We can become grief literate. We can have a society that is more grief literate, and that will be of benefit to all of us. Thank you.
In her compelling book, Opening Heaven's Door, author Patricia Pearson reflects on the sudden death of her father and the vigil death of her sister, lamenting that we have managed to lose language and ritual around the spiritual experiences of death. One could add, and the realities and limitations of COVID have taken both language and ritual away, but only to some extent. As a presider here at the Urban Good Family Funeral Home and a retired hospital chaplain, has been my great privilege to be part of this panel discussion this morning, Grief, Loss, Ritual, and Hope in the Time of COVID, with my colleagues Susan and Matthew. We were also part of a working group with Nita, ably chaired by Matthew, that shaped a local grief, dying, and death during pandemic resource that is now hosted on the website of Wellness Waterloo Region, and I commend it to all of us again. And it's been a pleasure to work with Chris, Principal Dean of Luther, and Nita, the Executive Director of the Glebe Centre, and their colleagues Mirko and Elma, to bring this together, this timely conversation, and to support the crucial work of the Glebe Centre, particularly in these liminal times that are apparently deepening. If in fact our screen time attention span is about 11 minutes, which is the time between advertisements in a television movie, which a few of us have been watching more of lately, then my allotted time this morning is to look at ritual related to grief. It might be anticipatory, as Susan has referred to it. It might be at time of need, as we say in funeral service, and it might be deferred, another funeral service term we'll come back to. And as many know too well, perhaps delayed or deferred. Either way, in whatever faith tradition of no particular affiliation or a hybrid, which is increasingly true of households, I prefer the word liturgy, which means the work of the people. Mindful that the word religion shares its root with the word religio, where we get ligament. So if you think of how a ligament helps a joint to do its work, then liturgy helps people to live out what they believe. So whether it's about dying or death or the afterlife, however it's understood, rituals are traditions, actions, and innovations by which we are spiritual beings, whether we're religious or not. Through 30 years of vocation in hospitals and faith communities, it's been my privilege to accompany many people who were dying, their loved ones, and other caregivers, in some cases with a liturgy to honor life and faith, sometimes quite spontaneously. The stories I share this morning are offered with the permission of the individual or the family. Two theological pillars for me are one in my own Christian tradition from the Gospel according to St. John, when Jesus is remembered reassuring his friends, and his death is imminent in his early 30s. And he says to his friends, "Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. In my Father's house are many abiding places, and if it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you." That's a beloved verse to many people, and perhaps more familiar with words like dwelling places or mansions or rooms. But scholars have helped us to understand that Jesus spoke Aramaic, and we think he said and meant abiding places. Abiding places. It's a wonderful word that has at least two meanings of abiding with the mothering love of God, that when someone dies, they do, but also they abide in the lives of those who love them, like that beautiful painting that Susan shared with us earlier. The other pillar comes from the Nobel Laureate of Literature back in 1924, Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote, "Death is not extinguishing light. It is only putting out the lamp because the dawn has come." unquote. Eternal or afterlife could be understood as the dawn, but it is the tending of the extinguishing of the light, including in the hearts of those one has loved and been loved by, that ritual or liturgy can serve a healing purpose. I'm indebted to my colleague and friend Dina Moitoso, who's recently retired from her 25 years of private practice in grief counseling based at Urban Good, who helped to found the Waterloo Region Suicide Prevention Council and continues to teach at Laurier. Dina, who has been ably succeeded here by Laurie Blakey, frames the therapeutic purpose of a funeral in this way. Dina writes, to bring community together, that love around us, for a journey continued of shared experience and support. Secondly, to neutralize the initial grief response to a death, whether sudden or expected due to COVID or other causes. And finally, to allow people who are heartbroken to feel validated and affirmed. And so with the initial, at least, pandemic limitations to vigils at institutional bedsides, then a maximum of 10 people, though currently more, allowed to gather at a time for a visitation, at a service, at a graveside, sharing the journey, neutralizing the crisis, and feeling validated has certainly been adversely impacted. To adapt a definition of hope, about which Matthew will say a lot more, I heard this when I was working in hospital ministry from a physician, and I know she used to share it with families. She would say, hope is envisaging a future that you want to be a part of. Hope is envisaging a future that you want to be a part of. And then she would say, and hopes change. So family and friends like family, as well as some in this hidden front line, as Laurie Blakey refers to, faith community leaders, funeral service providers, cemetery workers, counseling professionals. These are the hidden front line of pandemic. We've had to become even more creative and bringing this hope to life. For instance, the vigil of a once and always nurse. She was 92 years old. Even well into dementia, she would introduce herself as a nurse and say, could she be of assistance? And she was dying in hospital of COVID at the height of the limitation. And her family was out of town, but even if they'd been across the street, they would not have been able to be at her bedside at the time she was dying, actively dying. But the nurses who were caring for her gathered around her bed in full PPE and held hands around that bed. And one of them held up a camera and brought that family to that bedside in real time. And that funeral was deferred by many months, and when we gathered in August, that story was told. And it was a defining moment of her vocation, but also the comfort that those caregivers brought to her family. It was a ritual. Indeed, technology has increasingly become part of a funeral liturgy or a graveside, including live streaming, which is a variation of what we're doing today. When people are unable to attend in person or gather at a safe distance, and it also can be archived, which we hope will be a great resource for the Glebe Centre. Marvelous AV of pictures and music have been kind of a staple of these services for a while, but now sometimes we have tributes that are pre-recorded halfway around the world, as well as Zoom or FaceTime or other means at the graveside, where we often have a microphone now because tributes are being offered there when larger numbers of people are able to gather outside. We've also noticed that when people long for a sense of normalcy, some of them lose their filter of caution, and they reach out and start hugging and handshaking just to feel normal, at sometimes, unfortunately, risk to themselves and others. Another dynamic has been the need or the desire to defer funeral services until a time when more people are able to gather, which creates its own challenges with aspects of grief deferred, as well as having too much time to prepare and seeking to perfect a liturgy that can't be. I think there remains some ancient wisdom to the idea that it was 3 days in a tomb and then the body had to be buried, because the liturgy helped to carry the people in the early stages of their grief. Even before COVID, rates of cremation have increased considerably over recent years, so there has been more time, and in some cases too much time, to arrange a ritual. Now, I want to suggest that there's a wrinkle in this too much time situation where families are wanting and needing to do something at the time of death and then saying we will have a deferred service, which is fine, and that's happening. But we're also hearing families who are seeking or needing permission not to have that other service, particularly if they've had some kind of ritual because they're well on their grief journey. Among the many other suggestions I've heard about post-COVID liturgy is the possibility of a collective service, perhaps in a faith community or in a local community where many members have died and not necessarily of COVID. And they might gather in larger numbers at some point to honor all of those lives. And there might be people in the community who had a loved one die across the country that they didn't get to attend or honor, and that could be possible. And again, technology can be a link. We also have the challenge of reopening public spaces, sacred or otherwise, to 30% of their fire code allocation at this time, and we may need to weave technology and other creativity on an ongoing basis. Which brings us back to planning the ritual, and I want to suggest two questions. One of them is quite familiar and timeless, an open question: what do you need to happen in this ritual? But in these months, I've also learned a question that's worth asking. What don't you want to happen? To give people some sense of control of what is said and done. What don't you want to happen? And that's very empowering for them. Well, we can learn from each other, especially in these liminal times. I just want to touch on an example I learned of in the LA Times of a Jewish funeral custom from a writer by the name of Tom Fields Meyer. He reminds us that it is no less true in a sacred space that it's human nature that you don't return to a regular place. So that in some Jewish traditions, when there is a death in the community and you go back to synagogue, you don't sit in your regular place. As he writes, because we're unmoored, and we need to reflect that literally where we sit. So, the ritual at a bedside, in a home, in a funeral home, in a sacred space, at a graveside, can help us to acknowledge that we're unmoored. And there's a timeless truth that by naming something, it loses some of its power over us. By beginning a process of forgiveness, we actually free ourselves. By helping people to hear their own voice. By asking the question, and I learned this from a hospice volunteer, who would say to somebody in tears, if those tears could talk, what would they say? And we told that story at her funeral because that was part of her ministry to others, to ask that question. And by experiencing a familiar ritual or developing a new one, the healing journey through grief begins in earnest. I just want to touch on two other aspects, one being meditation, prayer, and music have all been anchors, particularly when we feel unmoored. They say to sing is to pray twice. That was either St. Augustine or Martin Luther. But pandemic precautions prevent gathered singing. That said, ritual can still be enhanced by musical accompaniment, and many services include vocal or musical instrumentation, like Gerald has done for us in the Prelude, and Matthew will. Now you have to, Matthew. And this pandemic has yielded some gems of material. I'm thinking of the pandemic prayer that was written in the earliest days of lockdown by Conrad Grable faculty member Carol Penner. It's called the Pandemic Prayer, and it touches on many of these challenges, and she freely offers it. Some of you will know of Father Mike Jonkus, an American Roman Catholic priest and musician. He's perhaps best known for his composition Eagle's Wings, based on a paraphrase of Psalm 91. Interestingly, hopefully soon President Biden often refers to it. Now Father Jonkus has composed a new and inclusive and hauntingly beautiful setting of Psalm 23, and it is very inclusive beyond Judeo-Christian shared scripture, and he has generously offered it in the public domain all this year, and it's called Shelter Me. And I encourage you to look for the composition by a group called Spiritu. Well, many religious traditions are grounded in gathered rituals or sacraments, and the limitations have been many. But let me leave you with two other thoughts. One comes from my experience with the privilege to conduct weddings, because as Susan has said, that's been another whole grief. For young people particularly, but anybody who wanted to get married this year, it's complicated. But I learned the most from a couple who decided to defer their wedding by a whole year. And he called me and he said something like this. He said, John, I'm 27 years old, and I've been looking forward to marrying my fiancée since we came out of university. And he said, I've also always looked forward to things that I know about, and I feared what I don't know about. He said, what changing this wedding and living through pandemic, just in our rather privileged life, has taught me is to try to look forward to what I don't know. To try to look forward to what I don't know. I told him he was an old soul, trying to make meaning when something doesn't make sense. So with apologies to David Letterman, if I were to have a top 10 of COVID stories since about March the 17th, it was standing in a small town cemetery when we were limited to 10, and I do mean 10. The casket, 9 family members, and the presider. Until we were 11. Because bounding over a fence comes a golden retriever. Their owner running frantically after them, realizing we're about to lower this casket. The dog had broken away from the lead. And the dog came right up and sat beside a young adult who was about to give a tribute to her grandfather. And she put up her hand and said, "Don't be concerned. I was about to tell a story about a dog because my grandfather loved dogs." And then she said, "I think that dog knew that." And so the dog sat through her tribute. And we were able to notice the unconditional love of a dog, be reminded of the unconditional love of God and each other as ritual. Well, I hope I've met the invitation of the Glebe Centre this morning with some of these reflections, and I look forward to our further conversation.
Give light, and people will find a way. Stand together, and people will find a way. Work for justice, and people will find a way. People will find a way, I do believe. As we find our way, what exactly are we hoping for? So many different things. We hope that an effective vaccine will become available sooner rather than later, that we will arrive into that new normal or that next normal, a new way of being. We hope for healing for someone we dearly love who is struggling with illness. We hope for justice within a particular political or social reality, for a way out of our own personal experience of loss, grief, or trauma. We hope for many things, but what is this thing called hope? I'd like to show you a picture of a quilt. It's what some people would call a crazy quilt because of how the individual pieces of fabric have been arranged. When you see the picture, I challenge you to find the pattern. So here's the quilt. Can you find the pattern? In the midst of all the shapes and colors, there is a pattern. And if you don't see it right away, that is okay. Keep looking. In the midst of what seems so chaotic, there is a clearly repeating pattern. You will find it. And if you don't find it on your own, someone else can help you find it, which is part of the point of this presentation. Because in addition to the wild chaos, we are also looking at a repeating geometric shape, in this case, which is a hexagon. And so there it is, again and again. The quilt is full of hexagons. And once you see the pattern, it gives you a totally new perspective on the quilt. If this quilt shows something about the current state of things, then hope is a way of seeing something more. For me, hope is astonishing. It's something worth studying and teaching and wrestling with. And I believe that hope can be integrated into everyday life for individuals and for communities. I believe that hope is individual and hope is political, and that we need to become literate in these interconnected ways of hope. Now, I'm aware that sometimes people regard hope with a kind of suspicion. Author Terry Eagleton has described hope as, quote, a castle in the air, agreeable company, but a poor guide. Fine sauce, but scanty food. Fine sauce, but scanty food. Well, if this event is like a meal, then Susan and John have certainly offered two very hearty main dishes. And my aim here is to present hope as yet another substantial part of the meal, not just a little bit of sauce to put on the top. So the ancient Greek myth tells the story of Pandora, who opens the lid of a very extraordinary box. And out comes all the evils of greed and war and disease, slander, and many other things. But Pandora shuts the lid before hope can escape. And ever since, there have been two interpretations of this. On the one hand, Pandora was able to safeguard hope, to keep it preserved because it is so precious. On the other hand, Pandora kept hope away from humanity because it is the worst evil of them all. Complexity of hope. In the context of climate crisis, for example, David Suzuki has said that if we take the time to reflect and change direction, we can hope that nature will be far more generous than we deserve. On the other hand, Greta Thunberg has said that she does not want hope. She doesn't want us to be hopeful. She wants us to feel the fear that she feels every day, and then she wants us to act as if we would be in a crisis. In another example, context of terminal illness, for some, hope can make it nearly impossible to face mortality. And it can actually increase suffering because hope compels more and more and more dramatic intervention. For others, hope can be a tremendous source of strength. And sometimes it can make the end-of-life journey very, very good. But my point here is not to leave you frustrated because hope is so complicated. My point is to convey how important hope is, not only for individuals but for communities. Hope is a way of seeing, and hope is a way of acting. We need to be able to see and to act with courage during these days. So what does it look like these days? Here are some images. I think of people choosing to wear masks over and over again. I think of hospitals and all of the frontline workers who heal and teach and care and clean. I think of Black Lives Matter and all those who are rabble-rousing for the sake of justice. I think of people finding ways to tread much more softly on our beautiful planet Earth and learning about our place in the grand scheme of things. In all of these images, hope is expecting, desiring, yearning, laboring towards some hoped-for vision. So with these images in mind, let's take another step toward what I'm calling hope literacy. The psychologist Charles Snyder defined hope as having to do with a combination of pathways and agency. And so in Snyder's view, hope begins with a goal of some sort, and in order to reach our goal, we come up with various pathways. Rarely is there just one way to do something, so we need different routes, different options for arriving at our goal, especially if one of those routes might not work out for some reason. But hope needs something else, which is what Snyder called agency. And this is the motivation, the determination, the sense that we can make a difference in life as we pursue one or more of these pathways. So hope has to do with identifying a goal, seeing more than one pathway to work toward that goal, and having the gusto or the inner power to be able to act, to proactively work toward the goal, even while not being sure about what will happen. Now, part of my background has involved studying and participating in various peace movements and social change movements. And this diagram shows some of the work I've been doing to bring together Snyder's hope theory with insight from the field of social movement studies, where there is something called a collective action frame. The way that a movement understands a particular social justice issue and then persuades people to get involved in that movement is what's called the frame. Figuring out how to frame an issue requires a lot of conversation, and it can lead to a lot of conflict. Scholars will sometimes describe this frame as a contested space. And yet, it can lay the groundwork for a lot of exciting momentum. So here we can begin to see a more complete picture of hope for individuals and for communities. Hope is essential for one person to live well, to be resilient, and to find their way. Hope is also essential for a community to be healthy and to find its way together. Hope demands something from everyone: artists, faith leaders, counselors, politicians, nurses, electricians, elders, children. Because hope needs both imagination and discipline. And so to come back to these images again, I believe we need to become hope literate in being able to see the connections between participating in public health measures, such as wearing masks, and participating in social justice movements, such as those struggling against institutionalized racism. And to notice a resonance in the visionary way of seeing how our actions contribute to hope in those different situations. We need to be able to see connections between healthcare and ecological resilience, and to notice how courageous action in the one can illuminate new pathways for action in the other. We need to be able to see how in our local community here, one person's story of hopelessness is linked to our collective story of new possibilities for wholeness and well-being. Ultimately, I think we have remarkable opportunities to teach hope within our community and to institutionalize hope in quite specific ways. Hope is a way of seeing both what is and what could be. And hope is a way of acting. We set a goal, we figure out several ways of working toward the goal, and we nurture the motivation to step forward. Right now, things might look wild and chaotic, out of control. Nevertheless, look for a pathway. Look for a pathway. And look for others who are also stepping forward. And so, give light, and people will find a way. Stand together, and people will find a way. Work for justice, and people will find a way. People will find a way, I do believe.
Thank you to Susan and John and Matthew for your presentations this morning. We'll now have a chance to have some conversation with our panelists. If you have a question, I'd invite you to type it into the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And I'll begin with one that's there now while the rest of you think and insert a question down there. Thanks to each of you for 3 very interesting and helpful presentations. Often people are at a loss for words in such moments. We want to be present for people to offer a word of encouragement or hope, but we are not sure what to say. There can be these awkward silences when we don't know what to say. In a time of pandemic, we often don't even get to express our condolences. Do you have any thoughts on what to do with these awkward or imposed moments of silence? I'd open that up to our panelists to respond, whoever would like to go first. The imposed moments of silence.
Well, Chris, right away, I think of a nun, a religious sister who trained me in hospital work. And she said, if I don't teach you anything else, I want you to learn to don't just say something, sit there. Don't just say something, sit there. And there's a lot of wisdom to that, and it's hard work, but I think a good thing. And whether that's virtually or actually, it's crucial.
Mm-hmm. Right. Susan or Matthew, do either of you want to chime in on?
I would add that I teach social work students, and I often talk to them about the power of silence. We need to be able to sit in silence. Sometimes not saying anything is more powerful. I mean, I think this is what John just said. That's more powerful than saying something, anything, or just filling the space.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more difficult right now with the pandemic, but we can be there for one another. And sometimes it might be virtual sitting with in silence, but we can still be there. And being there and showing up is what people who are grieving most often say they want or need.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll just add a quick thought to go with that too, that in times of silence, oftentimes those are the best times to get in touch with mystery and with a spiritual or religious perspective, if that's what we bring. If we come from a more philosophical kind of a perspective on life, even so, a moment of silence or a 5, 10, 20 minutes of silence can be a really great way of really getting into the heart of what it is that we believe. Again, whether it's a spiritual or a religious perspective or a philosophical perspective. But I think mystery is so important in all of this, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I think, the challenges of not knowing what to say, that struggle has been there for a long time, right? Pre-pandemic as well as now. And oftentimes I think we pressure ourselves that we should be saying something terribly profound, when actually often just some kind of a descriptive statement can be helpful. Like, I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry that it's so hard right now. I see you're really struggling. And then just to sit there and let there be space, maybe a little bit of silence, and let the other person then enter in a way that fits for them. And not put so much pressure on ourselves that we have to be saying something so wise or something so profound, because often the other person isn't needing that, right? Any comments on that in terms of people who struggle to what to say, what to do, which can be related to the silence?
I think one of the myths about grief in particular is that we shouldn't talk about the person who's died or the person who's not well. I think it's a myth that does a terrible disservice to everyone, and that's often a way to enter into the conversation, is to remember when so and so did such and such, or sharing a story, or asking someone to share a story. Celebrates the person, and if they're ill or they've died, it celebrates a connection. It celebrates a time when they weren't ill or when they were still alive, and can be very powerful. And it's not talking about the person is not talking about the person is more likely to be helpful, and not talking about the person is one of those myths about grief that really persists terribly.
Right. And that's a myth we really need to push against, that if we don't mention it, we would be helping them, when in actual fact, they've never forgotten. And it actually makes it more difficult in some cases that their loss is not being acknowledged.
Right. And people sometimes think that they shouldn't talk about a person who's died because they'll hurt the feelings of the person they're talking to. But the reality is that the person who is grieving is hurting.
Exactly.
And we may actually alleviate some of that grief and suffering by talking about the person more than treating it as a subject that we shouldn't broach.
Great. John, you want to jump in here?
Through the lens of ritual, I would offer that sometimes it's easier to deal with the more difficult subjects in, say, a tragic circumstance, sometimes in a prayer or a meditation time, because everybody is sort of centering themselves and they hear those words sometimes more clearly and offer them silence, back to Matthew's point, to connect with the mystery. So I don't mean to prescribe that, but I can describe that it's been very helpful. Say in the case of a violent situation or death by suicide, that you have permission to name it, but sometimes a place to name it is in a prayer or meditation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you.
We have a question from Sandy Shantz. Sandy asks, grief is highly personal feeling, but as Susan alluded to and Matthew said, it can be corporate. Matthew said, at least this is how I hear it, that hope is the way through grief to healing. As political leaders trying to manage corporate change and grief in these days of pandemic, how do we best connect the dots of the various groups exhibiting this grief and providing hope to them and to others?
I can start off with that. I think the number one thing is not unlike grief literacy, that it's about understanding the process and understanding the feelings and valuing those experiences and acknowledging those experiences, both in ourselves and in others. So, you know, in an organizational sense, it's really important to recognize that everyone is, you know, experiencing change. And in this pandemic, everyone is experiencing change. And for some of us, those can be positive changes, and others of us, they're very, very difficult changes. And holding a space for all of that to happen and not rushing the process. The process is, I think, really very, very important, and that we can't, like Matthew's shapes, we can't make other people see them in a way that's going to be helpful to them. If they're asking for our help, we can provide that help and maybe get, you know, assist them to see the shape. But if we're rushing that process, that's going to be a disservice to both ourselves and to them.
Okay, maybe I'll go on to our next question. If it looks like it's directed at John. John, you had mentioned neutralizing grief through ritual.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak a little more to that, please?
Well, my thanks to my colleague Dina, as I said, who helped to frame, to use Matthew's helpful term, the understanding of ritual in the case of death. But I want to walk that back a bit. I've been thinking about it since we've been preparing. I don't know that neutralizing is always the thing we want to do. And except maybe in, again, very traumatic, urgent circumstances. I think sometimes that ritual helps us to live into what we're feeling. And to pick up the other two, in a sense of community, and to be validated in doing that. So I don't mean to speak against what Dina said, but I've had a chance to ponder that a little more. And I think we're not always neutralizing it, but we're certainly acknowledging it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I suppose in the acknowledging of it, you could take some of the energy out of it, which maybe does neutralize it to some degree.
Okay, that's helpful.
Might be one way to think about it, but not neutralize it in the sense of it being nothing.
Yeah,
right?
Not minimize, but maybe
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, great.
Thanks,
John.
maybe just an additional thought to connect that with hope. One of the words that comes up when people talk about hope is the word despair. And maybe ask a similar question. Is part of our job to try to neutralize despair, or does despair actually play a very important role? I mean, at times, where being in a truly despairing place, at least some would argue, there could be a usefulness to that. I definitely struggle with that because my personality is such that I don't feel like that makes, it doesn't resonate with me in a kind of a personal sense, but I see, anyway, I'm just kind of riffing on this idea of grief and despair, and that there's something that it takes us into the heart of what is really going on, rather than pushing it away. Anyway, just it's something to wrestle with as well in terms of the despair piece.
Great, thanks,
And
Matthew.
I would add to that and say that there's a famous quote about in the grief world about the only way through grief is to grieve, that we can't avoid it, and if we try to avoid it, it will come back to us. So I think John's sort of differentiation between neutralizing and minimizing is that is a good one. That there may be times where, for various reasons, we need to help someone sort of put it aside to get through a moment, but that we need to recognize that that's only temporary. It's not going to stop the grief.
Mhm.
Well, for paused, I might just go back to Sandy Shantz's question.
Okay.
What I found interesting in a piece in the New York Times recently is there are now actually corporate grief coaches. And I shouldn't say so much grief, but spiritual ritual coaches in a corporate setting. That was fascinating to me. And they've become more valuable because of people working from home and losing the esprit de corps of an office. So how do they create ritual in a daytime? How do they create gathered space to be a community? So I don't know if that gets at Sandy's question, but these people are out there. The three of us should take this on the road. Maybe they could.
Right, yeah.
New job.
I think it does speak to the need, right? That as humans, we have that need, and how in a different context now that we're working so much virtually, how could there be a structure that would respond to that? I think it's important, John.
Yeah.
Adding another piece onto that question as well, where it's asking about connecting the dots and looking at how political leaders can try to manage corporate change and grief. Here's something that comes to mind. I'm aware that in our community right now, there's a really interesting initiative that's coming out of Well-Being Waterloo Region. And I encourage you all to look at this if you haven't seen it. Go to the website of Well-Being Waterloo Region. And right at the top of the page there's a campaign called Finding Hope. And it's just kind of getting going. And one of the initiatives there is a series of what are basically neighborhood conversations where people are getting together to talk about grief, hope, what is it that they're dealing with on the ground, day to day during these times. So in terms of connecting the dots, what I wonder is, here we are even in this event right now, we are a circle of lots of different people. We are politicians, we are counselors, we are professionals, we are workers of all different kinds. What would it look like for us in a group like this right now to connect dots between a neighborhood conversation that's going on in some parts of our community to maybe some of the strategic planning that some of our politicians are doing in terms of regional planning, how to connect that with maybe some of the school, in the context of schools, planning for different kinds of education. So I'm just thinking of the connecting of dots is a really powerful phrase. And I think we have some really great opportunities to reach out to one another and learn from each other, from these different parts of our community.
That's great.
I would add, to pick up on the word leadership as well, that I think that true leadership is also modeling and expressing vulnerability. And shout out to Brene Brown and all her work around vulnerability. That I think that is true leadership, is modeling that sometimes it's hard, and that leaders can have a hard time too. That's true leadership, is modeling and accepting all aspects of experience.
Right. Great. Thanks, everyone.